Let's get started. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this time to get together this evening and study your word again together. And thank you for being with us today and the things that we did. Thank you for blessing those things and for bringing us to this point. In your name I pray, amen. Okay, so we had to take a break last week, so I'm going to go back and refresh a minute because we actually didn't quite hit a stopping point last time. And just wanted to kind of remind you of, let's see if I can pull up last week's we kind of finished off with this conversation here, where the pattern that we've been following in this, what's known as the prehistory of man, in chapters 1 through 11, is one where God either reveals his presence or his presence is felt, and what that means. And then humans somehow screw it up with something that they've done. They respond in specific ways, certain ways, and then the blessing shows up again, and then they mess it up again. And then we had in chapter 4, we see Cain's line and Seth's line begin to go in opposite directions, because remember, Cain's line ends up with Lamech boasting of God's protection for 77 times 7 times Cain because of the sin he had committed. But we also saw in Seth's line that from those days, people walked with God. That's kind of the end of chapter 4 was that verse, or began to call upon the name of the Lord. And we know that as we get into the descendants, the generations we see in chapter 5, around closer to Noah's generation, we see Enoch, who obviously was walking with God, and we see that he is described as walking with God and then he was no more, meaning that we don't know that he passed away like the others, because the others, it says they lived a certain amount of days and then they died, and that little phrase is missing for Enoch. So that's kind of where we left off, is this alternating pattern. And of course, in Noah's day, then what we've got is a continuation of that. And we see that by Noah's time, sin has gotten to the point that, how does Moses describe it? It says that wickedness was great. Every intention of the thoughts of man's heart was evil continually. And this is kind of the clincher. In verse 6, and the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth. Okay. And it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds in the heavens. For I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Okay. So that's kind of where we left off, was the Noah's time. And so let's pick up there with God regretting the making of man. So that's kind of a curious turn of phrase. We don't often think of God having regrets. And it doesn't seem like an emotion. I mean, obviously, it's a human emotion, but it doesn't seem like an emotion that we would expect God to have. And where we need to be careful is that we don't try to attribute our human concept of regret onto God, because in this case, regret is going to take on a slightly different nuance to it, okay? And not have the, what we have to definitely avoid is that God is not regretting here because he feels like he's made a mistake, okay? And I don't think we can attribute to God some regret in a way that he's surprised by what's happened, that somehow the way that humans have ended up here, where it's evil continually, this probably was not a surprise to him. He was hoping it wouldn't happen, but the reality is that it was, and now he has this regret. And so we see that the regret is largely because man has gotten in this state. There is no way that we're going to be able to fulfill the purpose that God created us for at this point, not even in a little way. And so this is a moment where he's going to have to deal with it, okay, simply because of who he is. And we will talk about this nature that God has and what it meant for his people when we get back to Mount Sinai, okay? Because remember, this is the people we're talking to, is those folks around Mount Sinai that are trying to learn something about who this God is that they serve. And an important piece of that is going to be God teaching them that I am holy and you are going to be holy because I am. So we will talk about the holiness aspect of that later, but it's that holiness that's in place here. Because he is holy, because he cannot actually abide any sin in his presence, and there's no way to fix problem one that we were talking about coming out of chapter 3, where Adam and Eve have now disobeyed and have illegitimately taken this knowledge of good and evil. Then we've now kind of gone way beyond that, and humans are not going to be able to interact with him in a way. So that's one thing we'll have to get into. Another thing that I think plays into this is that while God's nature is not changeable and his mind is not changeable, he does sometimes change what appears to be changes his mind, in the fact that he oftentimes will interact with us as humans in a conditional way. Okay. And this is not a weakness on his part. This is the way in which he's decided to relate to us. And so an especially important part of this lesson for us is that God oftentimes will change his mind based on human obedience and behavior. Okay. So this is a pretty important lesson for these folks, as we know that a little bit from now, where are they going to find themselves? Wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years because they didn't get it. And we're going to have to try to teach this lesson to the next generation in Deuteronomy. Same thing. But we see this play out multiple times. I think probably one of the more famous or common popular examples would be Jonah, where he goes and preaches to Nineveh. God says, I'm going to destroy it, preach that I'm going to destroy it. And then, like we talked about, God changes his mind. He doesn't destroy them. Now, is it because God didn't do what he said? No, it's because Nineveh responded to Jonah with repentance, and for at least a generation, they did not, they obeyed him, and it wasn't until later that he then destroyed them with the Assyrians as they came in later behind them. Okay. So in this case, we see that God decides that he's just going to start over. He's going to blot everything out, start over. I'm going to take all of the animals, all the humans, all the animals, everything that had the breath of life in it, he was going to wipe out and start over. And then we see that he decides to just kind of keep a remnant or save Noah and his family. And then what else does he add? Animals, either 2x2s and a couple of 7s. And this is really probably the clearest message in this part of the scripture, especially as it relates to the overall story of the Bible. Okay. Because there's just no way we can read this passage and understand what's going on here and not see the messianic story play out. Okay, this whole idea, and we'll see this multiple times as we make our way through some of these Old Testament passages, that when you remember where we kind of started this premise was that Jesus is on the road to Emmaus and is explaining to the two fellows he's walking with how the Old Testament points to him. And from Moses all the way through the prophets and the law and the poetry, all of these things pointed to him. And this is how, is we have these stories that are repeatedly going to show us that there is a theme that God was trying to reveal that was clues towards how he planned to carry out this solution of redemption. Okay. And so in this case, we see one man's righteousness, Noah's righteousness, actually was important enough to save creation. Okay. Because not only did it save his family, but it saved the animals as well. So another way we could say that is that behavior and choices definitely do matter. Okay. And I think that's, again, part of that holiness that we'll talk about later. Why does he want you to be holy? Why is your behavior so important? And the connection here is that your holiness and your righteousness can actually affect those that are living around you and would be part of the world that you live in. Not to give too much away later, but we kind of see a even bigger example of this when Moses starts telling them the story of Abraham and Lot, remember? And the angels come to Abraham's camp and they say, we're about to go down to Sodom and Gomorrah and do what? Wipe it out. And Abraham begins to kind of argue in defense of that. And what did the angel say? If I can find all the way down to 10 to a few, I will spare them. And we saw Lot. Of course, his wife messes up and looks backwards, and his two daughters. We had 4. So none of them were listening to him. But we see that Lot's righteousness could have spared Sodom and Gomorrah if they had listened to him. And the same thing here. So one individual can actually cause the redemption and the salvation of others. And that's what Jesus does for us. Okay. Now, in this case, with the ark, this is a temporary salvation, right? Because Noah and his sons and the wives are going to die eventually. But in this case, they weren't dying because of the judgment that God was bestowing on the world at that point. Okay. Here, I want to kind of take a minute to track a couple of other things before we actually talk about Noah's, specifically go through Noah's story a bit and see what the key points are there. So when Jim was preaching through Peter, we actually see a reference to Noah. We'll come back to that one. I want to start with one in 2 Peter first. So this is the second letter. And in chapter 2, we get a pretty extensive warning regarding false prophets and false teachers. And we talked about that a little bit, those heresies and mysteries and all that kind of stuff that people get led astray on. And in this case, Peter is warning folks off of that, these destructive heresies that the church is susceptible to. And we see in verse 5, well, let's go back to verse 4 and start the paragraph. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but instead cast them into hell and commits them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until judgment, and he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness. Some of your versions might say a preacher of righteousness there. So the timing of when God told Noah he was going to wipe everything out and you need to build an ark, and then the ark was built, could have, there's some who think it may have been 120 years even. We don't really know, because there was a reference there about the days of man are going to be 120. Most scholars think that that's dealing more with the lifespan of humans at that point, and not a declaration that the flood will happen in 120 years, but we just don't know. But there was some length of time between the declaration of judgment and the actual judgment happening. During this time, we see that Noah was a herald of righteousness within his community. And we see that he was preserved along with 7 others when God brought a flood on the world of the ungodly. So, and then we see the reference, just like we talked about a minute ago, with Sodom and Gomorrah, making them an example of what was going to happen to the ungodly, and he rescued Lot. So this would have all been an attempt by Noah to be able to tell these people what's coming. And if they had listened, then God may have relented. But they did not listen. Okay. In fact, we see that explained to us by Jesus himself. In Matthew 24. This is when he's talking about kind of end days kind of stuff. But concerning that day, an hour, no one knows, not even the angels, nor the Son, but the Father only. So Jesus doesn't know when the last day is going to be either. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man, his second coming. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage, right up until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. And then he talks about that 2 men are working, one will be taken, one will be left. 2 women are grinding, and so on. But why would they have been taken by surprise? Because we know Peter says Noah was pretty clear about preaching righteousness and that the judgment of the Lord is coming, and they didn't believe him, right? And so this is exactly what was Jesus was taking those religious leaders of his day to task, is that the things you've been waiting for are here. I am the culmination of those things, and you guys aren't getting it. And you're not understanding it. And you know what? One day you're going to be surprised, just like the folks in Noah's day. They missed that message. And we see that also play out. And then back to that passage that Jim used was 1 Peter chapter 3. And I'm going to start in verse 18. What he's dealing with here is the suffering of the righteous, and how we should actually take joy and not necessarily pleasure, but we should take joy and comfort in the suffering, simply because we're being persecuted and we suffer for his sake, and there's nothing better than that. So he says, for Christ also suffered for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous. So that's a clear messianic description. So he, the righteous, suffered and died for us so that he might bring us to God, that peace that we were talking about. He was put to death in the flesh in order to be made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, and that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. So the righteousness of Noah actually saved himself and some of the animals and these 7 others, his sons and their wives and his wife. So in the same way, Jesus' work on the cross actually saves us, okay, in our unrighteousness. So he was put to death, took on that judgment on our behalf so that we would not have to, okay? And we see Peter here using this whole story as an example for what? Also what we talked about yesterday, baptism. Because in 21, baptism, which corresponds to this, the story of Noah, is now saving you. Okay, but notice, it's not because there's anything magical about the baptism. Okay, it's not saving you because it's somehow removing dirt from your body. And it's not removing sin from your life either. The way this works is that through baptism, what is baptism? It is us, it's a symbol, and it's us identifying, right? Just like we did yesterday with communion. Baptism is us identifying with, very specifically, the death and resurrection of Christ. So, as Peter puts it, it saves you not as if it was cleaning you, but it is as an appeal to God for a good conscience. Okay? So we are identifying publicly with Jesus' resurrection. This is what faith is for us, is that by undergoing baptism, we're proclaiming that we want to identify with Jesus's death, burial, and resurrection. And God will count that as a good conscience to us. It's supposed to reflect a good conscience. Now, what does a good conscience reflect? A heart. What's going on inside, our behavior, our motivations, the things that are going on. Okay, so the condition of the heart is really the key point. And this is true throughout Scripture, is what we do matters. Just going through the motions is not what Jesus or God is interested in. So this good conscience is these are kind of the conditions under which we can escape judgment. So what did Noah and his family have to do to escape judgment? They had to go into the ark, okay? And that ark represented the salvation for them that God identifies. And so here we have conditions, the condition of an appeal to God with a good conscience, or for a good conscience, that God would see us as having a clean conscience through the resurrection of Jesus. So the power here is the resurrection of Jesus, not us. And we see that all this plays out because he is now in heaven sitting at the right hand of God. I shouldn't say that. It doesn't say he's sitting. So he may be standing at the right hand of God at this point too. Because other places in Scripture, it does define which. He's there with angels, authorities, powers that have been subjected to him. Okay. And this is, I think, what Jim's definitely playing with in Revelation to really show the authority of the Christ as he returns in that second coming. Okay. So as we think about this then, when we go back to the Noah's story, we see that Noah found favor. And then through the rest of chapter 6, starting in verse 9, chapter 7, chapter 8, and most of chapter 9, we see his story play out up until about verse 17. Okay. And we're not going to necessarily go through all of it because a lot of the The details here and there are not necessarily that important, but there are a few things in here that are going to be critical. So let's jump to the end, because that'll help tell us or help us focus on what's important about the story in the middle. We see in chapter 9, verse 8. Well, actually, it's verse 9, but in verse 8, God says to Noah and to his sons, all four of them, behold, I am going to do what? I am establishing my covenant with you and your offspring after you. Every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and the beasts of the earth. As many as came out of the ark, it is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you, every living creature that is with you, for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. All right. So the covenant that God made with Adam and Eve, you remember, was kind of a conditional one. Okay. Largely, if you will do these things, or specifically don't do this one thing, then everything's going to be fine. But they messed up. That kind of a covenant is no longer possible. Okay, because we as humans are no longer able to even have a chance. Okay, I mean, we can get it right every now and then, but we will never get it right all the time. And so what we see here is kind of the first covenant, or the next covenant, which is unconditional. Okay, and this is one where God is promising to do something. We'll talk about the idea of covenants a little bit more later. But in this case, we've got God promising to do something. Okay. And do we see any information in here, this particular section, about conditions applied? No, we do not. Okay. So God is promising this without any conditions being applied on the covenant to Noah. So this is not to say that there aren't expectations. Okay. Certainly behavior even in Noah's day is going to be an expectation. We see Noah's going to mess that up too. But the bottom line is that the covenant, especially this part of the covenant to not destroy life by a flood, is unconditional. Okay. And again, this is not because of some weakness in God and the fact that he's not understanding what's going on. In order for a covenant to involve two parties, one has to be able to, or both have to be able to agree and be able to fulfill both sides of that covenant. Okay. And with this particular scenario in mind, what God has just promised to us, was there anything that Noah or any of the rest of us since could offer that was of equal value? Certainly not. Okay. So this is a great example of the unconditional kinds of covenants that God makes, where essentially God is promising something on himself and to himself, really. I mean, as you look at the verses that follow, it's kind of curious because we often think that the rainbow is a symbol to us that God made this promise, but what does God say multiple times? Verse 15, I will remember my covenant, and the water shall never again become a flood. When the bow is in the clouds, verse 16, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant. He added that adjective there. And he says to Noah there at the end, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. Okay. So what we see playing out here too is what theologians will often refer to as common grace. Okay. That most of us today would certainly deserve to be wiped out with a flood again. And I think we can all kind of agree on that. The world's kind of a messed up place. I think the good news here is that we're not really experiencing anything new right now. The world's been a messed up place, and humans are just messed up. And there's not a whole lot that has changed in these thousands of years that have passed by. So the common grace here is that God has now promised this unconditional covenant where he's not going to destroy things with flood anymore. And again, this is not to downplay how important our holiness is going to be later, but it just means that whether you're righteous or unrighteous, you don't have to worry about this particular event happening again. And that would be grace applied in judgment. All right, one thing I would say here too, like I said, we'll come back to the idea of covenants later because he'll make some with, he's going to make one, actually he'll make a couple with Abraham. He's going to make one with Jacob. And certainly as we are hanging out at the bottom of Mount Sinai, what's going on? He's making a covenant there, a big covenant there. So as we think about covenants, it's important to realize that covenants today are not like, I'm not sure where I am on the slides here, but the covenants are not like modern day contracts, okay? We tend to, especially here in our culture, we tend to think of this covenant as some kind of a contractual relationship between God and his people. And this is this would be a misrepresentation of what a covenant is. A contract, what happens if one party breaches on that contract? Then it's broken and neither party really has to really worry about what's going on. Okay, so both parties, all parties involved would be freed from that contract. In a covenant, what happens? If one party fails, the other party is still bound by that covenant if they took that covenant. Because I am taking that covenant on me, not based on you. Okay. Yes, I promise to do one thing and in return you will do something, but in that relationship, each party is agreeing to do their part. And if one person fails to complete that, then the other person under covenant law would still be required to maintain. Okay. And we certainly see that, or are going to see that out in multiple covenants that God makes with these folks. It'll be a while before we really see it, but we'll also see David and several others that have contracts or covenants that were made. And what's interesting is that who is the author of every single one of these covenants? God is. Okay. And don't lose sight of what we talked about yesterday as we were taking communion. What did Jesus say about that wine? It is a symbol of a new covenant. Okay. This is a story that's going to play out over and over and over again. And just like he was talking about on that road to Emmaus, every single one of those covenants teaches us something about him and the new covenant that he's about to author in. So God is obligating himself to, in this case, not exercise judgment through a flood and wipe out all of flesh again. Later on, he's going to make a covenant that he will bless based on certain things, or that he will do certain things. Blessings oftentimes had conditional elements to them, but he promised that he would never do certain things, and he did not. He would not break those. Now, like I said, there is going to still be some expectation here. Okay. So if we go back to our conversation in the letters that Peter wrote, referencing this whole passage in the Old Testament, what is our part? To have faith, to trust, right? And this has been an important piece since Adam and Eve: obey. Okay, we need to obey. And so we see, and we will see as we study them more and more, that covenants have a fairly complicated interplay between God's piece that he promises to do, but then aspects of it that will apply to human accountability, that he holds us accountable for the things that we do, the things that we say, and certain elements are going to be dependent on that. So there will be some conditional pieces, but the covenant itself is not conditional any longer. Okay, it has to be unconditional, simply because we have nothing to offer, and he knows good and well at this point, and so do we, if we think about it, have no way of fulfilling our side. And so we are destined to break it every time. Okay, so rather than go through the story kind of point by point, what I'd like to do, because we've actually already discussed this story, okay, and that is this story, as it plays out, is actually a second creation account, or it's God creating creation a second time. Okay, so basically I've just got a couple of charts here to kind of illustrate what we've got. So what I've done is just given us a comparison to see how the passage from chapter 7 through 9 mirror in many ways the story we got in Genesis 1 and 2. So we see at the very beginning how water covers the earth. Spirit hovered over the waters. Remember how important that was to that story. And here we have the ark floating over the face of the water. We also had a reference in 7 to the wind that blew across the surface of the water, remember? So that would have been a reference to the Spirit as well. One of the key points to the first creation was the fact that the earth was formless and void. In 7:23, we see the same kind of language. And of course, here, what's responsible for that void? He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the earth or the ground. Man and animals, and creeping things, and birds of the heavens, they were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those who were with him in the ark. And so, again, everything's now been zeroed out, with the creation as it is now being formless. And once we had that established in the first creation, God begins to create. Okay, now God's not creating from scratch here, so we're going to leave that slot blank for a second. After he creates light, and that won't come into this story, but in the next day, dry land emerges. Okay. And we see play out in Noah's story, the waters subside from the land, so land emerges. Here's a pretty cool piece. In the end of chapter 8, we see God talking to Noah. Well, actually, God says in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done this time. Okay, and here's a very important correlation back to our categories for the 3 sets of days and what God was trying to teach the Israelites during that creation story. So while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So those patterns that we talked about, let there be light, and there was light, night and darkness, right? And we had the sun and the moon to govern those time periods. Remember, days and nights are not physical beings, they are time periods. So he creates time, then he created the waters above and below, and the plants sprang up. What was that? That was kind of food and nourishment and provision. And then, of course, the harvest and the seed time. This is talking about that same thing, but it's also talking about that aspect of fertility, right? The be fruitful and multiply. All of these same themes that we saw coming out of chapter 1, we see God restating those within this story as Noah is floating on the surface of the water. Okay. In the first chapter, it definitely came across as God's provision. Here, it comes across more as God's promises, but really those two are interchangeable. We saw then in verse 1 or chapter 1 that man is made in God's image. In the next set of verses, where we see God blessing Noah and his sons, we see the be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth again. And we see that the spirit of man is important, okay, because in verse 6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. So a reminder of man as the image bearer is there. And then also in 11, actually, I think that's typo, that should be 6. Okay, on that bottom one there. That subdue the earth and have dominion. We're also going to leave that one blank because that's an interesting point as well. We'll come back to that in a second. Then we have God makes the covenant with Adam and Eve in chapter 2, where they will tend the garden and keep it. And then here in 11, that must be where I got it. This is where he establishes his covenant with Noah that we just talked about, where all flesh, or he will never again cut off all flesh through flood. All right, and as we finish off the story, we see man tending a garden in chapter 2. And of course, once Noah gets out of the ark, he becomes a grower of vineyards. So we see the man tends a vineyard in this case. Man sins by taking fruit from a tree he wasn't supposed to in chapter 3. Man sins by drinking fruit, or actually getting drunk with fruit from the vine in chapter 9. The immediate repercussions was that they knew they were naked. They responded with that shame and that guilt in chapter 3. This one takes on a little bit of a different approach in that it's actually Ham that saw his father's nakedness at that point. And this has very negative connotations to it. We're not exactly sure what goes on there based on the text, but we can tell from basically just in what is here, we can tell from the reactions of Shem and Japheth that something bad happened. Okay. because he tried, basically Ham goes in and saw the nakedness of his father, told his two brothers outside. So there's some element of trying to get them to participate in this with him. And then we see the author very clearly says, then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on their shoulders, walked backward to cover the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backwards. So we see it twice. That's what it means is important. And they did not see their father's nakedness. And when Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done. What happened when Adam and Eve ate their fruit? They knew. And in this case, he knew. Okay. So sin leads to knowledge, illegitimate knowledge of things that we shouldn't have known. God didn't want us to know those things, but we did it anyway, and now we do. Okay. So we would say that that knowledge was part of that, probably within the context of Ham seeing his father's nakedness. There was a honor and disrespect would have been a big part of that in those cultures, likely, and that's probably what's playing out. Adam and Eve tried to fix things by doing what? They made themselves some coverings. Well, we see Shem and Japheth trying to cover Noah. And finally, sin brings the curse. And in this case, as we finish off Noah's story in chapter 9, we see that Noah now curses Canaan, not Ham, but Canaan, Ham's son. Again, we don't have all the information on why he would do that. But bottom line, a curse is applied because a sin had been committed. Okay. So again, kind of top to bottom, chapters 7, 8, 9 is a restating of the same story, and that's the important piece. And this is why we can't take these and break them apart and just say, oh, that's Noah's story. That's really neat. This is the story of creation. That's really neat. And we're going to see next week that we can't take the story of Babel and say that's really neat, because what do you think is going to happen there? The same kind of framework. We're telling a one big story within these first 11 chapters to try to accomplish something specific. Okay, so let's go backwards a bit and hit those blanks, because this is what makes Noah's story a little bit unique. All right, so first creation, God begins to create. So what goes in that slot, do you think? Well, no, the ark was back there, the second one. This one's actually pretty neat because this one is the key to this story. He did. You're pondering. That's good. Well, let's help you a bit. So as we think about this, we see Noah was a righteous man, and you can kind of see the chiastic structure that we got going on. All right, so Noah's a righteous man. God makes a covenant. We get the ark built. Animals and food are brought. The command to enter the ark is given. And I don't know if you ever noticed or not, but Noah goes into the ark, and then it's 7 days before the rain starts. The ark is closed. The flood continues for 40 days. The mountains are covered. Waters prevail for 150 days. And then there's a key. And then waters subside for 150 days. Mountains become visible again. At the end of 40 days, the ark is open. We send out a raven. Then we send out a dove. There's your 7 days of waiting, same as before. We get the command to leave the ark. They leave the ark. We get instructions about some food, like what we can eat and so on. And then God makes that covenant we just talked about, promises no flood in the future. And then we see that all the days of Noah were 950. I've left out a few steps, but so it would fit on the slide, but what fits in the middle? So let's look and see where water prevailed for 150 days and water subsided for 150 days and see what phrase is used right between those. So it's got to be somewhere at the end of 27 and at the beginning of 8. And we see the waters prevailed on earth 150 days. And Joy is right. What is it? What do you see at the beginning of chapter 8, Ms. French? No, that comes next. That's after he decided to, that exactly. He doesn't decide to reverse until he remembers Noah. What was he remembering about Noah? That he was a righteous man and that he had promised to bring him through. Okay. So that's one of those elements that plays out in this story that was not part of the first one. Okay. We don't see God doing what he did the first time because of Adam and Eve or anything like that. This is an element that happens the second time. Why? Because this is the reason why he's doing what he's doing. God is recreating because of Noah. So that reminder that Noah is the one that essentially saved creation. Now, yes, God's kind of wiped the slate clean and we're starting over, but he could have wiped the slate entirely clean and started over. He did not. He remembered Noah. Okay. Yep. So that one goes there. That's an important piece. All right, let's check this one out. What do you think goes there? So this is here at the beginning of 9. We see be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. We see those both times. Right after be fruitful and multiply in chapter 1, we see that followed up with exercise dominion and subdue the earth. We do not see that again here. What do we see here? Verse 2. Of chapter 9. The beasts are going to be afraid of you, and they are going to dread you. So you remember the ultimate failure of Adam and Eve was what? That we will no longer be able to fulfill the role of dominion and subdue, those priestly roles, okay, in our fallen state. And so what we've got here is the difference is what tells us where the important piece of the story is that for Adam and Eve, subdue the earth and have dominion was what was intended by God for creation. But because we've screwed up, this is what God has to give us. Because this is the only way we can come close to even trying to make this work. Because Ms. French is right. These animals are going to turn on us more often than not. But they don't turn on us as often because they fear and dread us as humans. And I know you're aware of that. Okay, we do see it, that they do tend to have a fear of us that doesn't necessarily seem rational sometimes. Okay, and this is really the only way we have a chance of even trying to subdue and have dominion, even in a failed way. Okay. So God still intends for us to participate in creation with him and do those priestly duties, but this is the only way we can participate. And it's just a shadow of what God intended from the beginning. Okay. All right. So as we wrap up tonight, this is what I was referring to earlier. Humans are basically in the same state now than they were at Noah's day. Really nothing new under the sun. It's true that another day of judgment is coming. He promises that, and that's what we're studying in Revelation right now and on Sunday mornings. And guess what? That judgment and that destruction is going to be followed by a new heaven and a new earth, just like this one was. And how do you think that story is going to play out? Same patterns, except in this case, the Messiah has now dealt with the issues, and it's going to work this time. And that's what's going to make it amazing. Okay. But we won't do it tonight because Jim will eventually get there. But that's going to be the neat thing, that instead of light where we have to have sun and moon, what are we going to have? His light is going to provide everything we need. We're going to see streets of gold instead of rivers of gold and jewels and gemstones and all that. I mean, even before he gets there, if you go to those last 2 or 3 chapters of Revelation and read it, you should hear the same kinds of words that came out of the really chapter 2 with the garden. And all of that, the tree of life is there, tree of knowledge of good and evil is there, all these things are still there. And the nice thing is that we get restored and can now interact with him in that way again. Okay, let's see, I got a couple of verses here. Let's see what they are. 2 Peter 3:7. So Peter's using this story of Noah in that second letter to say, by the same word, the heavens and earth that now exist are stored up for fire instead of flood, being kept until the day of judgment, destruction of the ungodly. And let's see what this one says. A little bit later, but according to his promise, we are waiting for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness will dwell. So everything will be restored. And I think, as we think back to what we were talking about yesterday and the importance of being a disciple, okay, what was Noah doing while he was awaiting that flood? He was preaching. And Jesus said they didn't listen. It wasn't on Noah. It was on those folks. All right. And so we can only be responsible for us. And I think Noah's story for us is clear. He was righteous in an environment that was not very good for him. And we saw how in the end of 5, you remember what Noah's name means? Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, my son shall bring us relief from our work and the painful toil of our hands. What was he feeling? I mean, Noah's dad he's feeling a little worn down at that point about what's going on around him. And this line of Seth's. And so I think we should find great encouragement in that. Okay. That we are not expected to engage this evil in anything other than trying to help them to understand. But if they don't listen, that's not our problem. God has already provided us an ark in the form of Jesus Christ that we can take refuge in, and we are safe, and we will make it to the other side. So this is what I think is going to be important for these folks as Moses is telling them these stories, as they learn who they are coming out of Egypt. And this is going to be an important reminder that even though humans had fallen away, God remembered them and provided his presence one more time. And they still got one more episode to go. And this particular episode is important because it's going to show us there's actually a problem that has to be solved first. Like, you remember when God promised that there was going to be a seed of woman that was going to save everything. Eve named Cain, behold, God has given me a son, a seed. Because in her mind, what was she thinking? That was it. He's going to save us all. And she didn't realize that there's some important things that have to happen first. And God is going to show us that. He hadn't actually told us why yet. And he's going to tell us why in chapter 11. And then that's going to be kind of the end of what we call the prehistory, because right after 11, we get into Abraham and the patriarchs. Okay. So I want you to think about this week, because I haven't made up my mind yet. As we finish off the prehistory, I think there's a couple of ways we can go. We could go straight into Abraham and do the patriarch story. And this is the important piece that Moses is telling. But there's a piece of me that thinks that we should, now with this in place and understanding what the problems are, jump to the Israelites in Egypt, bring them to Mount Sinai, and then we can go back and understand why God has to tell them about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Tell them who they are and why we're going to create this tabernacle. So I'm going to let y'all help me decide which direction we're going to go. We're going to go to Exodus first and then come back to Abraham, or are we going to go through the patriarchs first and then get to, I don't think there's a wrong way. Just thinking about, yeah. Mm-hmm. Of why the patriarchs are important. Yes. So I think we know what Miss Frenchie's picking. But she might change her mind this week, so we're going to let her think about it. All right, but first we got to get through the Tower of Babel, so that'll be next week.
I love it.
Okay, well, let's pray and we'll head home tonight. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this reminder of your goodness. There's a lot of, we're just reminded of the evil and encouraged by the fact that nothing around us really surprises you, and that you've kind of seen it all before. We've just been bad ever since, and we really, even though we are saddened in our hearts and it eats at us, help us to just be encouraged by the fact that you have promised to take care of us, and that you have promised not to destroy us in a way that does not give us a chance to be restored to you. Thank you for giving us that chance. And thank you for the opportunity to study and learn about it. In your name I pray, amen.